Hi everyone, welcome. Today's check-in is with the original red wiggler worms, last visited in 12 days ago when their age had reached 100 days in service. And after 12 days now, since the last feeding, I'm assuming that they're probably ready for some more. So I'm going to slip on a glove, get these systems up on the bench, and we're going to get to feeding them. Let's get to work. I think we covered most of the stats on this green board here, but perhaps not all of them. I believe we didn't mention that last feeding on day 100 was their 10th feeding, so lots of very simple, even numbers to remember. Although I'm sure I could have remembered these numbers as well. Yeah, so at 112 days, the system's coming along pretty nicely. And it was a pretty interesting coincidence how almost all the foods that they got last time, if not all the foods, started with the letter C. So 100, kind of centurion, cent, 100, that's also a letter C. And then the foods were cucumber, corn, coffee, even coconut chips. Yeah, the coconut chips were something that were laying around here in a bag on my shelf, or on my bench over here, for the longest time, and it got to the point where I just totally lost track of the fact that they were just sitting there waiting for me to do something with them. And last time I was down here to feed these little guys, the little light bulb in my head went off and made me realize that, hey, perhaps those coconut chips were brought down here into the wormery for the purposes of composting them with the worms, so why don't we just get them going. I sprinkled them in here, not knowing exactly what to expect. I mean, coconut is just not one of those things that I even bring home. Ever, hardly. Not to mention coconut chips. So I'm curious to see if they were able to make anything of that. And, well, the feeding today includes more coffee, including 2 days worth of coffee filters, which can go in here as replacements for these coffee filters, which were just marking where we last fed, sort of feeding zone indicators. Even these pieces of paper are getting pretty tattered. I'm wondering if we'll be able to continue using them, draping them out as a top covering again, considering their pretty beaten up condition. Well, I've set them aside. Perhaps we'll see what we can do. I don't know, somehow for a 100-day-old system, or for 200-day-old systems, it does feel like we're getting pretty high up there as far as the level within the container. And then once I go in there and I start stirring things around and aerating everything sort of fluffs up and comes up even higher to the rim, getting me a little bit nervous. I don't like to work myself to the point where I don't leave ample space to be able to move things back and forth and shove things from side to side and do so without the risk of spilling things all over the place. Seems to me like a whole bunch of tomato must have been fed not too long ago in here, because little tomato sprouts are popping up all over the place. Well, let's see how they did. The cucumbers they got were the last remnants of my garden from last year, and they look terrible. From sitting in the freezer since last summer, the cucumbers had a lot of their moisture just drawn out of them by being in the freezer. Oh boy. So they were all wrinkled up and they looked pretty terrible. But I don't think the worms would have been too concerned with their appearance. I'm sure they were probably happy to go to town on the cucumbers. And guess what I think I just found here? I think I just found sort of the skin of one of the cucumbers in bin number 1. Pretty much looking like just thin tissue paper. Stripped clean of all the yummy cucumber that was in there. And that's not terribly surprising. Actually, that's pretty much what I expected to find when we got in here. 12 days is usually plenty of time for the worms to work their way through an entire cucumber. But don't forget, there were those other things thrown in here too. There was a whole bunch of corn. And corn is similar. Differently proportioned, obviously, but still there's the inside of each corn kernel which has the delicious yumminess inside of it, and then the skin of each corn kernel is a little bit tougher, I would imagine, to eat for whatever reason, sort of like the cucumber skin. So I sort of expected to come back in here and find a good many little bits of corn skin around, and that's what I'm seeing here, little bits of corn, most of which was probably, yeah, not all of it, I guess. Some of it still looks like it, yeah, like this one here, this little corn kernel still has the insides of it in there. So I guess the corn is something they're still working on. The cucumbers, for the most part, gone. Those coconut chips were sprinkled in on the top, and I figured if we were to see leftovers of those, they'd be evident right away. The coffee that we fed last time probably wouldn't show up as leftovers either, and if it did, then we would have a hard time identifying it against the backdrop of the rest of the material in the bin. Moisture is looking really good here, and we've, for the most part, excavated the feeding zone. And as you can see, in certain places I'm already right up to the edge of the rim of the container, making me question whether I would want to go too crazy with the application of bedding today. I mean, we'll give them a replacement feeding zone indicator, meaning that the old feeding zone indicator, the old coffee filter that was resting right on top of the feeding zone, could simply go into the feeding with the foods as sort of a very modest application of bedding type materials. And perhaps that's what we're going to do here today, because besides that, all this leafy matter that's resting out here on the surface that was sprinkled across the top will also get blended in nicely as bedding. So why don't we go ultra light today on bedding, and this way we're not going to give ourselves that feeling like we're going to run out of space in here anytime soon. These systems definitely look good. Lots of nice, happy and healthy looking worms crawling all over the place in here. It's kind of fun sometimes just to get a close-up look at these little guys. Although I do know that what I'm doing here is a little bit cruel, because I'm just putting them right out there into the bright lights, kind of forcing them to have to take cover. Well, they sure do vanish out of view quickly when they're motivated to do so with the bright lights overhead. And is that part of the cucumber skin right there? Perhaps I tore it as I extracted that handful of material. And here's even more worms. Quite a number of them as well. All over the place, and well, look at that. Seems like they're still working on this one cucumber here. See all the cucumber seeds? Those things are going to be sprouting, probably trying to grow here in the worm bin. So, okay, well, that's interesting to see, because the other one was completely stripped clean. Sometimes I wonder if the reason for the difference in the breakdown of very similar feedings is possibly the way I positioned the food item in mention. Perhaps I just obscured its access somehow, and they just didn't get a chance to get at it until they were able to get past whatever was in their way or something. So whatever the case may be, here's the half of a mango seed. This was a pumpkin stem, so there were other things in here that date back to previous feedings. And man, just keep bumping into large mounds of worms all over the place. Another pumpkin stem. Keep forgetting that this is a system into which we evidently put a whole bunch of pumpkin stems. Because there was one over there and two over here, and those are the sorts of things that are just going to take a very, very long time to break down. Well, they've left some leftovers, kind of making me glad I didn't go overboard on the portions for today. Besides those 2 days worth of coffee I showed you earlier, that other thing that you saw was some leaves of radish. And you know, I forgot that I did intend to apply a couple napkins down into the feeding zones today as supplementary bedding. So besides the repurposed feeding zone indicators that are going to become supplementary bedding, they're also going to get napkins. So that makes me feel a little bit less stingy as far as the foods that we're giving them. So let's go ahead and pile in the coffee portion. Alrighty. Setting aside the coffee filters to be our feeding zone indicators, but I'll set them aside momentarily just so we'll have a chance to level things off here after we've reset the feeding zone and replenished the supply. So pumpkin stem, half of a mango seed, the leftovers of the last feeding, mainly the skin of the cucumber and the actual remains of this not fully eaten yet cucumber. And then I guess in can come a somewhat lightweight meal in terms of the radish leaves, and you can see there's even the little bits and pieces of radish that also are accompanying this feeding. Stuff is all kind of attached to each other, a little bit stringy, but I think that's going to be their feeding. Not a terribly large one, and a little bit skimpy on bedding, but every now and then I feel like I've got to keep an eye on how things are coming along in my systems and not allow myself to continue to go haywire and overboard if it starts to seem to me like that's been my trend. And perhaps that has been my trend here with the amount of stuff that's been getting piled in here, with the level of it rising so quickly. So we're just going to back off a little bit. Hopefully the napkin and the repurposed coffee filter will be sufficient as far as bedding goes in here. And now I'm just going to bring in some material from the outer edges to help level things off and cover up the feeding zones, with the secondary purpose of trying to get all these nice leaves that were out here on the surface blended in too, so that we make all that stuff a little bit more readily available as bedding to them rather than just having it sitting out here on the surface. As for whether or not we're going to be able to drape out those old newspapers that were resting on the surface, we'll have to see. We'll do our best to lay them out, but I think this will probably be the last go around for those pieces of newspaper. Next time we'll just use those as supplementary bedding down in the feeding zone, and maybe come back in here with some sort of a replacement top covering. And today we'll also hold off on putting any more leaves out here as a top coating too, because I think I'd like to see the level in here in both systems drop down a little bit. Here in bin number 2, it doesn't feel like we're approaching the rim quite as much as we are in bin number 1 somehow, even though we do attempt to be pretty consistent in both systems in terms of how much stuff we apply and what we apply. It does feel to me like over in bin number 1 we have managed to get pretty close to the rim of the container, especially now that everything's all aerated and fluffed up. And I'm pretty sure that within a few check-ins we'll start to see all this stuff begin collapsing nicely. And well, that's probably the best I can do with this particular piece of newspaper. Maybe this one held up better. Somehow this one seemed like it was holding it together a little bit better. But, sometimes when it gets folded over on itself, it's pretty difficult to detach it from itself, and then it starts tearing. There we go. Perhaps they're not covering as much space as they had in the past, but that's just fine. I think we'll be good, The other thing I did notice was a little bit of flying insect activity. So I've been trying to leave my mosquito dunks nearby in all cases so that I can be really vigilant in applying this stuff pretty liberally, because in the past this stuff has done a pretty good job helping me control, oops, forgot the feeding zone indicators. well, whatever. We'll put them on top now. I could already imagine some of the viewers out there saying, what about the feeding zone indicators? Yeah, you know, the mosquito dunks has saved me in the past. I do remember a pretty wild outbreak of flying insects causing me lots and lots of grief, and then that was when I learned about the effectiveness of mosquito dunks to control these fruit flies or gnats or whatever these things are, and they are starting to show up in my bins now, and I think that's the reason we're going to have to start doing our best to try controlling their numbers before we have some sort of a crazy situation happening here. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.